Hello and welcome to the Lively Faith Podcast. I am your host, the Reverend Nathan Stomberg, Rector of Holy Communion Anglican Church in East Greenwich, Rhode Island. And today I'm joined by my co-host, the Reverend Mark Galloway. Mark, it's good to be with you again, discussing
always a pleasure, my friend.
All matters of importance here. You may also have noticed we've got a new gig here. We've got a new studio, and we're excited to be here. Change of scenery. You can see all the books on the wall, which I've definitely read, every single one of them. I just really want to show you all how smart we are. So today we're going to be digging into some matters which are really pressing on the world stage. Of course, before we get started, please take a minute to share the podcast with a friend if you've been touched by it. It means a lot to us, and word of mouth is by far the best way that we are able to grow between that and, of course, God's grace. So, Mark, today we're really going to be discussing responding to world events as a Christian. For anyone now, especially by the time this episode has come out, the acceleration of world events, of chaos, of war, of violence in the world is really just mind-boggling. I think really going all the way back to the Russia-Ukraine conflict and even before, but of course, with events coming out of Israel, with the terror attacks by Hamas against the Jewish people there, and what is probably the most brutal act of terror witnessed by my generation for sure since 9/11, and of course, the worst atrocity against the Jewish people since the Holocaust. It's really beyond words, I think, the evil and the strength of the imagery that we're witnessing. I haven't personally sought out some of the pictures that have come out of there, but of course, we continue to pray for peace and the protection of innocence everywhere. But I think most would agree in this era in which we live that we are entering a new era of global geopolitical unrest and instability, and there's much going on for us, for people to be anxious about. So the goal of this conversation really is, how should Christians think about war, global unrest, and evil across the world? Because that's, I think, going to be ever present at the front of our minds, and by the time this episode comes out, we don't know how things will have changed, but certainly they will have changed and evolved. So I'll kick it off there if there's anything you'd like to add to that.
Well, the first thing I would say is that there's nothing new under the sun here, right? And I think not that we want to be able to say there's something new under the sun. Jesus said, you always have wars amongst you, right? But I'm always the same yesterday, today, and forever. So in context, the world's bigger, right? At the same time, it's smaller because of technology. But there's been world conflict going on ever since the beginning, ever since Cain and Abel, even. In previous generations, people weren't even aware of what was going on in different parts of the world, that people were killing each other, and genocide was going on, and atrocities. We're aware of it at such a higher level. I mean, you only have to go back to the Second World War generation. They weren't even aware of the atrocities of the Holocaust for a long time, right? Even though the great Armenian genocide had taken place during World War I. So that doesn't lessen the grossness of what's going on, and the fact that it's right on your cell phone.
Well, a corollary to your point there is our recent conflicts really are the first within the smartphone generation, and with the ubiquity of those,
right,
with social media.
Right. Yeah, so somebody my age and older, we remember reports every night in Vietnam, for instance, would come across, and they weren't always without an agenda from the media. But so it's not that it's new. It's just that it is escalating, though. It's escalating because we're so tribal, and we're becoming more tribal as nations. And as not just international law and order breaks down, these things are inevitable. And the weaker America becomes, the more this is going to happen. And the more indebted we are, the more it's going to happen. We have less ability to equip ourselves. We've made tremendous mistakes in just the last 2 years since the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, with giving away our arms. We're down missiles that are going to take us years to rebuild. So if stuff really goes haywire, we're not prepared to do a ton of things. So there's so many things that are involved just from a sociological, socio-political standpoint, without bringing in theology even. We could have hours of conversation about. But yeah, it's horrible what's going on. Always strikes me about these things about Americans is that your point is, young people now see it on their phones, so they're protesting, right? You and I would agree with much of the protesting, right? But when it doesn't affect them, when there's atrocities going on in different places in the world in the last 20 years, it doesn't affect the American or in their pocketbook, they don't really care, right?
No.
In the Sudan, for 30 years, they were killing Christians, right? Nobody really cared. Or Somalia, right? Black Hawk Down, the movie Black Hawk Down, right? Americans have totally amnesia. So we have this moral eruption about some issue, but we don't really care that the Uyghurs are being persecuted and being eliminated by the Chinese right now. So, and they're Muslims.
Yeah.
Right. So there's this utter inconsistency to the American psyche about justice, especially in the Judeo-Christian understanding of justice, and about how a just God really works, and what God is no discriminator of men, as the Acts of the Apostles says. And so there's always this disproportionate reaction to something that we as Christians, and certainly as theologians, have to be able to react to rationally, especially to Christians and to the people we're called to shepherd, so that we're not caught up in the fray of just endless throwing innuendos and misinformation out about everything that's going on out there, because that would be an hourly process.
Absolutely.
At this point. So,
not to mention, so you mentioned there's usually a knee-jerk overreaction, and then especially in the West, there's a snapback to whatever your political priors were. You put your blinders back on, and as Christians, we need to be equally sensitive to that as well, that we're always being called to the narrow way as far as the Christian mindset and the Christian worldview. So one of the reasons we're talking about these things is so that we can think these through with our audience, and then also be able to better articulate the Christian worldview throughout these issues, and applying natural law, first principles, to these ways of thinking and to these world events.
Yes. It's as simple as the product. Excuse me, it's out of my head. The Lucan parable, Jesus, the
prodigal son.
No, the other one. The guy is beat up on the side of the road.
Oh, the Good Samaritan.
Good Samaritan. Thank you. And we forget Samaritans were hated. Right? They were ethnically hated by Jews, and of course, the parable is the Jew helps the man, pays his bills, because he sees him totally as a human being, as somebody created in the image of God, not that he's a Samaritan. And that parable really surmises everything we should be about, right? I don't see that going on, right? And even in the reaction of Christians and certainly governments and people's ideological insanity about some of this stuff.
Right. I think so. I'm just going to follow the flow of conversation here. Really, one of the first things that comes to mind as we talk about thinking through things from a Christian perspective, we need to be, we are stewards of the truth that God has revealed to us. And in order to be faithful stewards of the truth, we need to hold ourselves to a standard of intellectual honesty and be able to engage with these different ideas, even when they're uncomfortable. And so the first example that comes to mind, again, most recently, in light of Israel's war with Hamas, is the Muslim question. And it's the same debate that roared into American political discourse post 9/11, where you have people who snap into two camps, right and left, both making their own errors, where on one side you have an inability and a hesitance to say that radical fundamentalist Islam is given to either Islamofascism or the rise of terrorist groups, and instead you want to rationalize and attribute to them a mode of Western thinking which they absolutely do not have. And on the other hand, you have camps of people either within conservatism or really more so, I would say, on the political right, who you really just you're tempted to demonize and group together a whole group of people and a whole world religion in a way that isn't true. And you spoke of this at great length a decade ago, and in the decade prior to that. You think about Muslims, and if you ask the American populace, especially during the height of a lot of this fever pitch of the conversation post 9/11, well, where do most Muslims come from? And 99% of people would say, oh, well, they're all Arab. And that couldn't be farther from the truth.
Right.
It couldn't be more harmful. The majority of the greatest concentration, the greatest proportion of Muslims, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is Indonesia.
Southeast Asia, yeah.
Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
And so really the minority come from
Africa, yeah.
come from Arab descent. And it's just one great example of how we need to hold ourselves as Christians, as thinking Christians, to a standard of being able to discern between what's actually going on here. Our defense of natural law, of first principles, has to be rooted in just that, in God's revealed truth and his revealed word. And that means speaking to both the worldview issues that there are, and there are many ways to dovetail it here. There are groups of people, terrorist groups, some associated with Islam, who do not think the way that Westerners do and have absolutely no compatibility or willingness to compromise with Christians and with Jews and really with the West as a whole, because they value death and we value life. And no amount of reasoning or rationalization on our part is going to change that. And on the other hand, being able to separate our political priors from the defense of life, from the defense of first principles, and really the guarding of innocent life across the world. So a lot of different directions to go there.
Yeah, exactly right. And again, American speak when they should keep their mouth shut until they actually learn something, right, about reality and history and the social political reality of the Islamic world, which is not uniformed, right? And even from the religious perspective, Christians do this. They do this with Judaism, constantly with the years teaching. They're like, well, Judaism's like Christianity. It has denominations. No, it doesn't. Judaism's not anything like Christianity. It's totally other. Judaism is the following of individuals to rabbis. That's what Judaism is. Islam's the same way. There's no uniformed Islam.
No.
And it gets its own twist in each geographical, socio-cultural area in which it exists. And it gets laid in its interpretation thereof in those places. So it's not like Christianity, which has this long-rooted tradition of morality and all of these things that systematically build theologically. So, but the average Americans become so anti-Christian themselves, or at least ignorant to Christianity, that they can't make any. To them, they're all like equal, right? And so they can't just take Islam at its value, face value, at its word. So let's say the Quran. So we're going to take the Quran and the New Testament and talk about how each document treats human rights, the dignity of life, and so forth. You couldn't be any further apart.
Right.
Right. And that's just a fact. You know, I'm not here speaking as a fascist, anti-Islamic person by saying that. This is what the Quran says about. Quran doesn't even tell you if women can go to heaven. Never mind.
It's
just a fact, right? So all of these things, but they don't matter in the political diatribe that goes on in the country, right? So the theological piece of it very rarely, almost never comes into the reality. So we, even, our politicians on the right, they always end up qualifying their comments about anything that happens around terrorism that comes from an Islamic origins or cell is like Islam is a religion of peace. I don't find that in history that Islam is a religion of peace.
No, the evidence isn't there.
Right. So it's like it's not really a true statement. In fact, Islam's goal, stated goal in the Quran, is to rid the world of Christians and Jews.
And it really helps to look at it comparatively from a historical perspective. You look at the first 300 years of Christian experience, and they weren't in power, were they?
No.
And yet you had 12 guys who were tasked with spreading the gospel, sharing the love of Christ, which caused the explosion in the spread of Christianity. And they were all being martyred by the Roman authorities. And then contrast that with the first 300 years through the spread of Islam. And how did Islam spread? It was through military conquest, which again is another
conversion.
And forced conversion, which is another ignorance on the part of most Westerners today, that actually Islam, through the initial spread of Islam, that constituted one of the greatest military campaigns in all of history and took them right up to the Battle of Tours when on the footstep of Europe.
Oh, yes.
And so we're also not talking about people who have just lived in rocks and caves in the Middle East for their entire life. It's totally historically ignorant to think about it that way.
The height of their culture, it was unbelievable.
Yes. Right?
They are literally prehistoric compared to what the height of the culture was. Yes. So when something like the Hamas attacking Israel thing happens, as it has, you can't instantly educate all these people about reality, right? So it becomes unbelievable, as it is that Palestine, which isn't a real place, right? The Gaza Strip is not a nation; it's part of Israel, right? Which is another. Just again, if you have you ask the average person, is Palestine a real place? Is it a nation? Yes, they would say it.
Most would say yes.
No,
it's a sovereign
it's
country.
part of Israel, where people with most primarily Muslims, Arabs are allowed to live, right? But it's not a separate nation, right? So it's a terrorist attack. It's like it would be like a modern Confederate state rebelling against the United States, attacking it. That would
Good
be
analogy.
Yeah, that's what it. So immediately when you have politicians and religious leaders and others saying Israel doesn't have a right to defend itself, to retaliate against really a terrorist group using Palestinians, they use them. They don't care about the Palestinians.
Not at all. They're hiding behind them.
They use them to attack the country that they want to destroy, right? The first principle of Judeo-Christian understanding of sovereignty is every nation has a right to defend itself, especially against unprovoked attack. So that's where you start, not by saying, "Oh, they have the right, they have the right to attack you because you did this and this and this in the past." And so, and as you know, there's a whole chain of relationships behind what's going on. Hamas is supported by Iran, which is backed by Russia, which is backed by China, and all of this stuff goes into it. And the fact that Israel is a democracy. It's not a dictatorship like everything else around them, or a monarchy. Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iran is run by a state church, right? A fundamentalist religion. They're a parliamentary democracy. Arabs are free citizens in Israel.
Yeah.
A third of the parliament is made up of
Knesset.
Arabs.
Yeah.
Arabs sit in the
That's
parliament.
not what an apartheid state looks like.
It's not an apartheid state at all, right? And in how it came into existence wasn't to oppress Muslims living down on a strip of land that we now call Gaza. They're ethnic groups that all those other Arab nations don't want them. They could take them in at any point. They could take them in today. They could take all 2.3 million people off the Gaza Strip and bring them into Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Jordan, Syria, anywhere. They don't want any of those people because they don't care about them. They want to use them politically to their advantage.
Absolutely.
But they don't really care about their human rights.
Well, and so Israel asked Egypt to open up its southern border with Gaza, and they said, nope,
no,
not touching that.
They don't say so. It's this endless lies and falsities that going on about which even how those people even got there, right? And so that was British Palestine before the Second World War, right? And so United Nations establishes this place where the diaspora of Jews who just had, millions, 6, 7 million of them murdered, and they were persona non grata in Russia and everywhere else. So there's this place that's established by the world, United Nations, and there happen to be these Arabs that live down on the strip before you got into the Sinai Desert, right? But they didn't belong to any nation before that either. So it's all this history that it's just history and facts don't matter, right? How a Westerner can't support Israel, I'm not saying that Israel never makes a political mistake like any other country, but they're a free country.
Right.
They're a democracy, right? I was reading a thing on Netanyahu. Oh, he's a dictator, and look how many times he's been prime minister. That's because he's been elected prime minister.
Yeah, he's not forcing his way.
Right.
It's
there. Like the great Disraeli. Disraeli, was prime minister 4 times in Great Britain. It's not because he made himself prime minister. It's because his party got back in power. Right. Again, Americans don't even understand how a parliamentary system works.
No, not at all. They
don't even understand they don't understand how Canada's system works. So never mind trying to explain to them what's going on in the politics of Israel. The other thing, I went to Israel 30 years ago, and Israel is the most efficient country on earth in every single layer of its existence. It was just an absolute godforsaken desert when they got there in 1947. And it is an oasis. They have unbelievable farming. They produce like half of the citrus fruit all for Europe. Up in the Galilee, there was 500 million landmines or something like that at one point. The Syrians and Jordanians that put up there, they cleaned them all out. It's like Garden of Eden up there, right? They use every inch of their land. They are the most efficient fighting force on earth.
By far.
Yeah, and so and this is what's so sad about being manipulated, the average Arab that lives in the Gaza Strip, being manipulated by these terrorists, Iran and ISIS and other groups using like-minded people that infiltrate into the Gaza Strip to attack Israel. You got to be an idiot to attack Israel.
Absolutely.
They'll fight you to the death. And here's the other thing. Israel is part of NATO. They have full voting rights in the United Nations. We are by law obligated to defend them, both the United States and all of NATO, which includes Russia, by the way, which is bizarre, right? And Great Britain. So Israel will not be defeated.
No, they can't.
Will not be defeated.
And they can't even afford the semblance of defeat. So even if they hold off the attack, if they give the terrorist groups the opportunity to claim victory, that is going to embolden their enemies and threaten their existence as a state.
You're absolutely right. The saddest thing for the innocent Arab that lives in the Gaza Strip, and that's we'll have to qualify that at some future point, because at some point whenever you live under rule that is dominated by terrorism, you're not really innocent.
And they
Right.
they were
So that's
they were
another
elect, yeah,
that's another moral principle.
Yeah.
We'll leave that to the side. But this war isn't going to be about when they finally just end it, right? There's a ceasefire. They're just going to level this place.
yeah,
They're going to surround it and isolate it for decades.
siege it. Yeah.
For decades. So it won't reemerge. That's what's going to happen. And
Yeah.
not because they initiated it, but because Hamas and the strong men behind it were foolish. Again, what they thinking? My guess is we're so weak as a country. We have such a weak presidency. We have so much chaos. We don't have the Speaker of the House right now. The time. This has a lot to do with that timing.
One can't help but wonder how things would be different if we still had a presence in Afghanistan.
Oh, it would be totally different.
But
even if we had a different foreign policy.
yeah, oh, absolutely.
If we had the previous, I'm not even going to get into the thing about the merits of the two presidents, but they would have never gone in there under the previous president.
No, that's, I think,
Never.
no, absolutely not.
Not. And the other piece, not to interrupt you, is Americans think it's bad, right? We're not ready, but I see no reason between now and November of 2024 why China's not taking Taiwan.
Absolutely not, especially in light of Russia, Ukraine, and with the brazenness of Hamas. And especially if the United States now gets pulled into moderating and maintaining not peace, but preventing a broader conflict in the Middle East. There's really no reason why China wouldn't be emboldened to move against
what
Taiwan.
would we do? What would we do?
Well, exactly. There has been no precedent, no peace through strength demonstrated
And of course,
in the last several years.
you and I know this, right? And many of our listeners know this. Then Americans would be PISSED.
Now all of a sudden you can't get
Right.
your microchips. Things are really expensive.
Things are going to go
now
through the roof.
now we're mad because I can't.
Now I have principle.
Yeah, all of a sudden it comes back, and I want to tie that back in, right? Because for us, thinking Christians, we need to avoid the temptation of projecting our political priors onto global events as we see them happen. We've seen it. Russia, Ukraine was a perfect example, right? All of a sudden, everybody's flying Ukrainian flags, and Ukraine, which
It was such a great country.
which all of a sudden, which was an awful country when certain phone calls are being made between the president and Zelensky years before, all of a sudden is as white as the driven snow and could do absolutely no wrong. Which again, you don't need to be given to a particular side in order to honestly engage with the fact that corruption is a central part of how Ukraine has operated.
Absolutely. The reason why it's not a member of NATO, it's not a functioning country. Right. It's corrupt to the nth degree. It's a tribal factionalism that exists within an artificial border.
So here's the complexity and the nuance that as Christians we need to make a diligent attempt to adopt is it was wrong for Russia, a brutalist regime, to advance against Ukraine as a sovereign nation, while at the same time you can say that and not have to fly the Ukrainian flag from the front of your house.
Yes.
You don't have to.
Yes.
You don't have to jump at the front of the parade of saying Ukraine is this champion now of Western liberal values. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive, and so the same intellectual discernment and nuance is also not to say that these conflicts are at all the same, but applied to Israel-Hamas, where you can assert that there were atrocities committed against an innocent people by Hamas committing these terrorist acts against Israel. You can defend their right as a nation to defend themselves without having to give into, say, a temptation to Christian dispensationalism, starting to wave the Israeli flag, and then now reading into verses of the Old Testament, such as, like pray for the peace of Jerusalem, pray for the peace of Israel. All that to say, for all this time, we reading the Old Testament in light of the New Testament would say Israel is the people of God. It isn't all of a sudden the Bible commanding us to pray specifically for the nation of Israel, which did not exist as a geopolitical entity prior to its canonization. So
as it existed since the
layers and layers
our
and
French
layers.
took them out 3,000 years ago, right?
So, I mean, for the listener, if that sounds like a lot, I mean, that it's because it is a lot, and it's because we as thinking Christians need to hold ourselves, and it is a lot of work, to a standard of being patient and really challenging ourselves to think through all of the wrinkles that come with these global issues.
Yeah, just for, I don't think all of our listening audience on the Catholic side would understand what evangelical dispensationalism even is.
Could you explain that? I think you do a better job than I could.
Dispensationalism literally is an American invention, primarily since the 1850s, but took steam up after the Civil War. And it's the view of what will be taking place sociopolitically in the second coming of Christ, and then the timing, this premillennial, post-millennial evangelicals, and you really literally cannot find it anywhere in Christian history. Not even the magisterial reformers ever talked about these things, right? So the historic position of the church is it's amillennial, that we already live in the end times, right? Because Jesus was born in the fullness of time, brought forth, right? And the new Israel isn't a piece of land, piece of what was useless land until the modern folks got there and turned it into, a productive piece of sand. The new Israel is the church. It's
exactly.
It's the bride of Christ. It's not anywhere on earth. It's not a piece of land in the Middle East, right? It's impossible because of the incarnation,
right?
Right, that we're not closer to God or Jesus in any location, right? Because Jesus is omnipotent and omnipresent, and it's like the real presence in the Sacraments. They're as present in a cave in Afghanistan as they are in Canterbury Cathedral, right? Because that's how God works.
Yes.
And that's the point of the Christian message. And so you're right. So when you'll have thousands of evangelical preachers talking about how this is all tied to the end times and different dispensationalist theologies, and many of them will contradict each other because there's no such thing as one dispensationalist presentation, and that modern Israel is the key to all this. Because modern Israel is an utterly secular state. America is far more religious than Israel. The overwhelming majority of people who live in Israel, Arabs and Jews, are not religious. So if you took a poll, like how many Americans go to church on a Sunday, it wouldn't be close. Americans are the most religious people in the Western Hemisphere, even though we're in massive decline. Israel, like Tel Aviv, the modern state, it's got more to do with Rotterdam than
it's more like a Silicon Valley.
Yeah, than it has. The old city. People think of Jerusalem, they're thinking of Jerusalem quartered into the four parts, right? It's like a misconception of what Israel, or the Wailing Wall, because that's all they ever see is these competing rabbis with a bunch of Arabs on top of the Wailing Wall with their guns, right? They don't really understand what modern Israel really is. And so it's, again, you can't have conversations without productive conversations that could possibly lead to solution if you can't even deal with historic reality and what actually is going on in the world. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know 10 people I even associated with can even have this conversation. That's pretty sad.
It's very limited.
Yeah, and as Joshua said, that's why I'm just a complete weirdo, because you actually can talk about something from historical perspective. So this is not going to be pretty, this thing with Hamas. By the time this thing airs, a month from now, 6 weeks from now, hundreds of millions of gallons of water are going to go into the bridge. So there could be a bunch of dominoes fall, but America, with probably Britain having to get behind it, it better stop it quick.
Right.
Because,
It's a powder keg.
you can't empower Putin any more than he already is. And the Chinese will do that, but they'll do it in their subtle, fake, disingenuous, deceiving way, while they keep producing fentanyl that comes across our southern border. So it's just a mess. It's a political mess. But it goes back to our weakness as a country, our moral decay and the collapse of the family, which has led to all this tribalism politically, and then our indebtedness. Just 2 weeks ago, for the first time, and the American, not that we ever pass a budget, we haven't passed a real budget in 35 years, but $1 trillion a year, we just flipped it last week, will go to just service the debt, interest on the debt. And again, Americans, like when the president talks about he's lowered the debt, anybody who ever buys into that should just go away, right? We never ever lower the debt. It might slow the rate of the debt at some point, right? So
yeah.
America brings in about $4.5 trillion in tax money a year, which funds the government. $1 trillion of it next year, well, beginning right now, will just go to service the interest on the debt.
Right. Not even the principal.
1/4 of every tax dollar that comes in just services the interest on the debt. It cripples us.
And
it cripples, and it's just going to go up and up,
especially
and up,
because
and up.
you have to keep interest rates high in order to control the inflation,
right?
As a result of the limitless
just
spending.
Horrible government, both parties. Horrible government that isn't about the common good. It's not about the future. It's not about our children and our welfare. It's like the school systems. It's about the kids. No, it's not. You're just ruining our children in the school systems. Right?
If Christians ever needed more reminders why we don't put our faith in government to begin with.
Right. And it's like, that's why I'm not a political ideologue about parties. It's like, I have my instincts are in a certain direction. I wouldn't ever deny that, but it's both parties just play footsies with all this stuff.
That's all
they're not interested in ever solving the problem, either side. They're just about regaining power. And so that's where all this political money goes. It's like black matter in space.
Yeah.
Where does it go?
It's like a black hole.
Like, where does it go, right?
Yeah.
And so, we're so powerful. America is so powerful. All the times I've taught, civics, at every level of my experience as an educator, as a clergyman, the average American just doesn't even understand how powerful of a country we are, and that when we're weak and we're doing really stupid things, it has cause and effect on the rest of the world, and human rights get destroyed when we're weak, right? To whom much is given, much is expected. And never in the course of human events has more been given to anybody than the United States of America. And we're squandering it.
Yeah, big time.
And that's the Judeo-moral issue.
Yeah, it's just a matter of stewardship.
Which I don't know very many clergy that would have put whatever word you want. Mine wouldn't be a very good one. So put whatever you word in there, they don't have it to even tell their own people the truth about what's really going on in the world. And so they want to reduce this Palestinian-Israeli conflict to some easy answer.
Yeah.
It's a two-state answer.
Yeah, they want it to be simple. Yeah.
Two-state answer. It's like the two-state thing will never work. So it's not an answer because they could never be self-sufficient as a state.
That, and it also waters down the ideological differences between the worldviews, which is another topic I wanted to bring up briefly here, is how world events such as these lay bare the inherent incoherence of a moral relativist worldview. The whole coexist bumper sticker on the back of the car. We know how much you love these bumper stickers.
They're awesome.
Where
I just had a mural painted in my bedroom
wall. You've got
wall.
coexist, and you've got the Jesus fish and the Star of David, and
that's why I wear all these pins on my jacket.
Yeah. And you've got the crescent on there, and of course one of those religions wants to see all of the others annihilated.
Yeah.
And so you can't coexist, and you can't attribute a Western frame of radical individualist, moral relativist thinking to people who will say to your face, no, actually, we want the infidels to be erased from the face of the earth.
Isn't the ultimate question, I think we've talked about it. I remember in your theological formation, even 5 years ago, is that Sharia law can't exist in Western constitutional law. It can't exist. It's incompatible to freedom, right? And so France wouldn't deal with it.
No.
They're paying the price. England wouldn't deal with it. They're paying the price big time, right? And here we go down the same road. Michigan, Detroit, Muslims have a working minority in the city council, right? So there's entire sections of Detroit are just off limits. The cops don't, you're just free to practice Sharia law in there. Nobody's going to bother you, right? And then we have, the progressives in Congress yakking about human rights and women's rights and all this stuff. And meanwhile, they support the inaction of this, parts of Virginia have it. It's just like, what do you do with that? What do you do with that, right? You're going to, it's inevitable, a conflict. We used to say geographically between East and West, right? Islam, the free West. But now it's not geographical, they're so intermingled.
Yeah. Because
of open borders in Europe, open borders everywhere. It's kind of like what's happening in the United States with the political divide between red and blue. And you guys have heard it, right? All the time. We're going to have another civil war.
Oh yeah.
We're not going to have it. You can't have a geographical civil war because we're not divided geographically.
Right.
We're divided ideologically in different pockets. So, we're really what we're going to find is ourselves dividing into these federalist districts that live separate lives from each other. And in a lawless society, really just ignore the Constitution inside those federalist districts.
Yeah.
That's where we're headed.
Yeah.
As a people.
So I want to kind of recap by laying out the progression of these ideas. So you have, I would say, the moral decay of the post-Christian Western culture really being grounded in Judeo-Christian values. That moral decay is in large part due to a moral relativism that eschews absolute truth as revealed by God in Scripture and through the Ten Commandments. So you've got a moral relativism that then asserts, you've got my truth, you've got your truth, who's to say what's right? That expands out more broadly to a cultural relativism, where now, because you can't say what's true and what's false, all cultures have to be treated equally too.
Oh, yeah.
Which is totally contrary to the very reasons that Western culture was so successful to begin with, because it was able to promulgate Judeo-Christian values large scale. Again, with qualifications to be said as to how faithful as a culture we were religiously, but that's beside the point. So you have moral relativism leading to cultural relativism, which says all cultures are equal. And now you have cultures pitted against each other, which are very much not equal to one another. You've got cultures and traditions which are espoused by terrorist groups, which will say, I want you wiped off the face of the earth. But a blind post-Christian West doesn't have the moral categories to be able to engage with that. So when someone tells you, I value death, I want you dead, we can't coexist, we would ask ourselves, well, what do they really mean? There's no way they could possibly mean that. They must have been wronged. They must have been oppressed in some way. Let's try to bargain with you to see how that works. And all that ends up in is bloodshed and tragedy. And you multiply that calamity because you've torn down your borders, because why have borders if it's all the same and there's really no reason to delineate between one culture and the next?
Right. as if the Ottoman Empire never existed,
Yes.
right? Like, it was such a great place, the Ottoman Empire. Yeah, this inability of is it a majority of Americans? I don't know, that really don't understand that you can't be a country without a sovereign border.
Absolutely not.
You can't be it. You cease to exist within a generation of what you were. And again, constitutional law, you can't have law and order. That's against the law right now. The open border is against the law.
Yeah.
Right. And literally, you have people just they won't even admit what's going on. That whatever thousands a day come across there, and somehow it's good, and or just won't even admit it's even happening. It's like, oh my gosh, it's.
So to pull that thread even further, because we opened this up talking about first principles, right? Christians, we need to be able to return to that. The principle behind it is it simply isn't loving to open up your borders to any Joe Schmo who wants to come in without any requirements put upon them, because you're going to be opening up your borders to people who either openly want to harm you, or, and this far more frequently than this, you're opening it up to people who you're unable to care for. So it's really not loving, because you're just welcoming them into a situation of perpetual poverty, to crime, to sickness, because you are incapable of caring for them. So it's not loving. And there's a strong parallel to that within the church, within the liturgical traditions, when we talk about communion.
Oh, absolutely.
And you and I read, I can't remember who wrote it, but there was an excellent article about the parallels between the importance of borders as applied to the Holy Eucharist, where the church, if she is faithful, she's not just going to allow any old person to receive Holy Communion. You need to be, as we would say in our Anglican, our independently Anglican tradition, our congregation, that you have to be baptized in a biblically orthodox church in order to receive the Eucharist. And why is that? Well, because as Scripture tells us, if you are not in a state of grace, and you are not of the proper disposition before God when you receive the sacraments,
right, penitential.
You receive it to your condemnation. Yes. So it is the opposite of loving to give Holy Communion to people who are not prepared to receive it.
Completely.
And so that's where you see the parallel.
So it's true of every sacrament, right? So that's why the borders to marriage. There's borders to marriage.
Yes.
Only biological males and females can be married, right? Because of the natural order from creation, as Jesus said, right? And the purpose of what marriage is. And so when you change the borders of marriage, blessings, or however it's declared in same-sex unions by the secular law, you're signing your own genocide, right?
Absolutely. Because
only males and females can reproduce, right? Our birth rate in America just went under 2 for the first time ever. So, and I was reading at 2050, the amount of Americans who will even get married will be 30 to 35% of America. That's not Judeo-Christian marriage, just married.
Just any.
Period.
Yeah, I believe
right?
it.
And so the birth rate they're predicting for a large segments of females, it was almost a third, will be 0. Right? See, so you have open borders. You do not reproduce. At least the current homogeneous population of America does not reproduce, and yet you keep spending more money. You're already spending $1 trillion of service interest on your debt, but you're not going to have future generations of children. Who's going to even pay taxes?
Right.
Right. It's the same thing as the fall of the Roman Empire. It will collapse, and it won't. It will collapse faster and faster and faster. With the rapidity is going to just really pick up. There's not enough people. There's not enough money. More demand on resources, and of course, while you're alive, the average person doesn't give a poop. because they're grandma's getting her stuff. They don't care about what's coming after them because they're not rooted in a value system that cares about love their neighbor as themselves in the first place.
Nope.
So every empire declines that abandons God and the family, and we're the same. And you can't fix it. Once it starts, you can't change the tide.
No.
And again, you can't get elected to Congress saying that.
No, that doesn't work very well.
You can't get elected to Congress. Just the economics. I taught this civics course earlier this year, and these are like at least interested people. These are like libertarians, Trumpy types, clean government types, and they asked me to teach this course, and they weren't completely, not even close to being educated on the Constitution themselves, but they deal in their own sound bites, right? And so even the people who are concerned don't really grasp the ultimate problem in America is we're economically collapsing, right? We're just totally economically collapsing, And remember, I don't know, you guys are too young, but when Al Gore was running for president in 2000 against Bush, they were arguing Social Security, and he goes, well, all the money when I'm president for Social Security and Medicaid and Medicare goes into a lockbox. Do you remember this? You ever hear that?
But
as if there's a box you can put money in. And I sitting there, I was teaching, I go, the Fed can't do that. And women goes, ask me, I go, because the Fed doesn't have any money at all. I go, they don't produce goods and services. They just print money, right? And then they pretend they put it somewhere for you, which just devalues your dollar, which means you can't buy anything. Inflation goes up. Then the whole cycle keeps going and going and going. And it's just, again, the basic economics, the average person just can't grasp it. Oh, they don't want to. I don't know. Maybe you can give me a better answer to that.
Yeah, I think they either you can't grasp it, or you're given to your political priors and you don't believe these things to be true, or you refuse to engage with what the economic realities are, or you don't care. And I think for the most part, people just don't care because they're largely getting what they want.
Godless people don't care about them. They only care about the immediate. It's immediate gratification. It's like an addiction to alcohol or drugs or sex or porn or whatever. It's about immediate gratification. And that's what dominates most people's lives, this immediate economic gratification or eating chocolate or whatever. Like Germany and England are in massive demographic collapse. They will not exist in 50 years. And people go, you're just making that up. I'm like, no.
Or even if they still exist in name.
Well, they'll exist in name, but
demographically, it's going to be a totally different place.
There won't be any people. There literally won't be any Caucasian Europeans living in those countries because they're just never going to be born.
Which to tie it back into our earlier conversation, the issue with that is not about race. It's about the inequality of cultures. And so you either believe that Western civilization was the greatest vehicle of human flourishing, or it's not. So, of course, if all cultures are equal, then that's fine. But then all of a sudden things fall apart, and why is this happening? But it's not a racist thing. It's not because you think less of people of different ethnicities. It's because when you're importing other cultures without any sort of rubric, then eventually your own moral system is going to be overrun.
Oh, absolutely. And because the most baffling thing is, for a historian, is where has Marxism ever worked? How's Venezuela doing?
Real Marxism hasn't been tried.
How's Central America doing? How's South America doing, right? Cuba's been a paradise for 65 years, right? The Soviet Union didn't work, right? China doesn't work. China's in worse economic shape than the United States of America, right? Probably the real third leg threat, because it's a democracy, is India. who has more people than China.
Yeah.
And down the road, I don't think I'll be alive. I wouldn't be surprised if India is the world power.
I think so. I think they've positioned themselves because China is going to collapse demographically the same way that the West is, and so
Right,
yeah,
China
India
needs more people.
And it's really really interesting because I think outside of, and I won't pretend to be one of these people, as outside from a very few, I don't think anybody observing world events ever would have predicted that.
No.
So it is, it's endlessly fascinating.
Well, but it also tells you that colonialism wasn't all negative, was it?
No, I mean a lot of what they have in place is because of
virtually all of it,
institutions that the British put in place.
Right. So there's all this irony and twist of history.
A lot of irony there.
Right. That you could be the world power in 75 years because of colonialism.
Move that back.
Why did I do that?
I don't know. I guess if people are tired of listening to you, then we can pull the mic away.
It's so complex, right? And so this Hamas Israel thing and the Russian Ukraine thing is, here's an analogy. Tell me how wrong this is. You guys were not long from being born, but when I was first in grad school, the great Ethiopian famine was going on. I don't know if you remember Michael Jackson, they all saying, "We are the world." It was this
song.
Right. And so typical emotive response to this problem, right? So they got the most famous people together, and Jackson writes this song and it goes hit, and all the money was supposed to go solve all of the famine problems in Central Africa and so forth. And of course, most of it went to the black market. The food all rotted on the docks. And after 2 weeks, Americans forgot all about it. Mm-hmm. It's like waving our flags after 9/11. That lasted like 11 days. Yeah. And then we went back to it. He's long deceased now. And a moral theology professor was talking about famine in Africa and in Indian subcontinent. And he says, and this was a forum we held each year at Providence College. Speakers would come in. Hundreds of people there, right? And he says, I'll leave his name out, but he says, you know what the best thing we could probably do for the Indian subcontinent, Central Africa, people who, practice Hinduism and worship cows as deities and eat the grassland and turn everything into desert, is just let market forces take their course for 2 or 3 generations, and maybe they'll realize that's not a good idea. And I'm not sure that's not the solution, because we can't fix all these problems.
No.
And the solution is, you've heard me use it, eat your stew for a while and see how it goes, right? It's like this thing with Russia taking, eventually they're not, Russia's a mess, right? So they'll get, the whole time they wanted free access to the Crimea. That's what this is about, right? They want to be able to go right to the ocean and do their stuff, right? So they'll end up with a third of that land or whatever. But they're only a country of 140 million people, Russia. They have one of the lowest birth rates in the world. They have the highest abortion rate in the world.
Their GDP is the size of Florida.
Florida, right. They're never going to be able to rebuild Ukraine back to what it would take. Putin would be dead 4 times before. Yeah. So sometimes that's the answer. Now, that would all make a lot more sense if we had our you-know-what together in the United States of America, but we don't. We don't. We can't even get ourselves together, never mind fix all these world problems. Yeah. And so, but that's a harsh reality, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. Difficult things to think about because there is an inherent instinct in the West to want to say, well, no, it's unloving if we don't try to impose ourselves and fix everything that's wrong in the world. When, again, when you're talking about nation states, your primary responsibility is to yourselves first, and then to be stewards beyond that. But you can't. It's just like the problem of sin. This side of the veil of tears, you're not going to fix it all.
Yeah, the best way to evangelize is live by example. So the best way for America to share the benefits of constitutional democracy is to live it. When we've tried to export American form of the Republic, where has it worked?
Nowhere,
No,
really.
it hasn't. So why is the most successful form of government and the most successful form of free enterprise in human history why isn't it able to be exported?
That's a great question.
Right. So and it's not because it's obviously not the most effective form. Right. This group of little 13 tiny colonies that have become the greatest empire in the history of the world. Right. And so the answer is you can't make anybody do anything. They have to want to do those things. Right? That's true of our moral lives. It's true of the civic life too. And so we never seem to learn that lesson, though.
No, we don't. I think so. And that's a good segue to really tie it all back together. How do we think about the conglomeration of world events, and when, especially in the face of war, in the face of brutality, it always comes back to eschatology. And that is the impulse to nation building, to trying to solve everyone's problems. It's a built-in eschatology to a secular post-Christian West. Now, for the listeners, right, a reminder, when we talk about eschatology, we are talking about study and thinking about the end times, about death, about judgment, how the world's going to end, and the afterlife. And so for us here on Lively Faith, for all of our faithful listeners, is that the only way that we can have this conversation and engage with world events without totally losing our minds, without losing our peace and giving in to despair, is through the Christian faith, through an understanding of Christian eschatology. And so what do I mean by that? I jotted down a few notes here. Of course, when like you said, there's nothing new under the sun. And Jesus himself warned us that there would be wars and rumors of wars before he came again. And that paired with an understanding of the book of Revelation, not to get into how one might interpret the book of Revelation, but all can agree that things are going to get worse from a world events perspective than they're going to get better, that is, through the second coming of Christ.
Yes, right. And eschatology, proper eschatology, hinges on the ultimate fallacy that happens in our culture, right? So if you guys ask your colleagues, your age bracket, whatever, people you've known, you say, are we humans, are we by nature basically good or not good?
And of course, the answer would be, oh, well, we're basically good.
We're good, right? And that means your eschatology is going to be wrong, right? Because if we're by nature good, that means it's like the whole fallacy of science is always leading to the betterment of humanity, which is a fallacy. It's a fallacy because human nature isn't good by nature. You have to choose to cooperate with God's will, right? And so eschatology is your understanding of eschatology is going to be based on your understanding of human nature.
If humans are by nature inherently good and not given to evil, then it is incumbent upon ourselves to save ourselves. But the reality is that because human nature is inclined to sin, we are incapable of saving ourselves, which means you need a savior extrinsic to the curse of sin in order to save us. And that is exactly behind every single conflict of ideas that we've talked about, every single literal conflict is the conflict of those two eschatologies.
Right. And it goes back to very profoundly what you said earlier in this conversation, many times with me, about all cultures unequal.
Right.
There's no original sin in Islam.
Right.
There's no original sin in Judaism.
Right.
That people don't like that. Yes, it is. It's in the book of Genesis. Yes, but original sin is Pauline.
Yeah.
It's Pauline. Paul is the one who defined original sin. It's not part of Jewish thought, right? So of the three monotheistic religions, two don't believe in original sin, which means your understanding of human nature is distorted. And you can see, especially with Islam, how distorted it gets, right? So therefore, because you're by good and you're doing God's will, I won't mention the name, therefore you can justify your behavior and your mode of operation to achieve your ends, right? Which again is incompatible to Christian understanding of theology and the incarnation and all of the other things that come systematic with Christianity. Because Christianity is the fulfillment of Judaism, and Jesus is the Son of God. There is no more revelation besides Jesus. So therefore, anything that claims to be revelation and of divine origin outside of Jesus is false. It's false. It's a false ideology, which leads to false everything else, right? And the problem is most Christians don't believe that, which means they're not really Christians, and they won't even admit that's even the premise of Christianity in the first place. And so that's where we find ourselves in Western culture.
Absolutely. That really hits the nail on the head there. So to put it another way, if you have your sense of human nature messed up, if you've got a false understanding of human nature, then your salvation, your inclination to salvation is going to be in search of an earthly utopia and trying to make everything perfect and right here and now.
A bizarre Pelagianism, right?
Yeah, and that would get applied in all sorts of different arenas, be it political or environmental or socioeconomic, but you see it playing out between nations here, where you may be inclined to say that, well, the only way we are going to achieve peace in our time is either to eliminate this nation, or to get rid of all the terrorists, or for democracy to be taken up by every single nation across the world, which we've just demonstrated is never going to happen. Versus, and then again, you can apply that to, oh, well, actually, we need to save the planet from environmental disruption or disaster. Versus our hope is in the second coming of Jesus Christ. We know that not that we give up on trying to love our neighbor as ourselves and steward the environment and being charitable to everybody, but that our problems, the problem of sin, is not going to go away until Christ comes again.
Not at all.
And that's where our hope is. And that is what protects us from losing our hope and from falling into despair, no matter how badly world events spiral out of control.
I've been asked, more than I can count. What's the solution? The Great Commission is the solution. That's what will change the world. It's the Great Commission. Because if every heart was converted to Christ, Hamas wouldn't be attacking Israel.
Right.
Russia would not have invaded Ukraine. Right. All of these things, all the atrocities that we can speak about wouldn't have happened if there is truly conversion. Right. If Jesus is literally Lord of the world, it would be a different place. But even God himself knows that's not going. Our job is to preach the gospel as many are willing to listen. But he's coming back again to judge the living and the dead, and his kingdom will have no end. And he'll separate goats from sheep. So there's clearly going to be a differentiation going on at the second coming.
Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. Right. And so while the state has a responsibility to bear the sword, we as individuals need not get all worked up as to how we're possibly going to exact perfect justice, because that is God's responsibility.
Absolutely. I agree. Yep.
So to wrap things up, I want to conclude with a passage from Paul's letter to the Romans, which I thought was appropriate and very much encouraging in light of everything that is going on with global conflict, and who knows what is going to be happening when this episode releases. Paul quotes Psalm 44:22 in chapter 8 of his letter to the Romans when he says, "Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? As it is written, For your sake we are being killed all the day long. We are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am sure that neither death nor life, nor angels nor rulers, nor things present nor things to come, nor powers, nor height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord.
Amen. How true.
And with that, we will conclude today's conversation. Certainly days more worth of discussion to be had, but I thank you as always.
Thank you
for joining me. Thank you, dear listeners, for thinking these difficult issues through with us. And if you're interested in more great conversations, please subscribe to our podcasts. Please share it with a friend if you've been blessed by this conversation today. We cannot grow without your help and by God's grace. We look forward to seeing you next time. God bless.